The sky is bruised violet and gold. Salt wind carries the taste of diesel and rusts across the deck of the carrier Zuikiku. Lieutenant Takeo Yamada stands in the pre-flight briefing room, his fingers tracing the worn silk of his Senenbari belt. 1,000 stitches sewn by 1,000 women, each stitch a prayer for his return. Around him, 23 pilots bow their heads as the mission commander unfolds a map across the table. The objective is simple: intercept the American convoy reported 70 miles northeast of Kwajalein. Yamada has flown 62 combat missions. He has seen Pearl Harbor smoke rising like the wrath of gods. He has watched Zeros carve through Chinese skies like calligraphy written in contrails. He knows the feel of silk control stick, the shudder of 20mm cannons, the way engine oil smells when it's burning at 15,000 feet. What he does not know, what none of them know, is that the sky they are about to enter is no longer the sky they conquered 3 years ago. The morning briefing mentions new American aircraft. The words are clinical, stripped of alarm: improved performance characteristics, enhanced armament, increased production numbers. Yamato listens but does not truly hear. In his mind, the Americans are still flying the clumsy Brewster Buffaloes that tumbled from the sky in 1942, still relying on the chunky Wildcats that a Zero could outmaneuver in its sleep. The Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service has owned the Pacific sky since December 1941. They have written the rules of aerial combat in the blood of their enemies. Speed, agility, range. The Zero has been untouchable, a samurai sword against crude clubs. When Yamada climbs into his cockpit 30 minutes later, the rising sun painted on his fuselage glows like a promise. He does not yet understand that promises made in 1941 have an expiration date. The Zeros lift off in formation, their engines singing the high whine that had become the sound of Japanese dominance. Below them, the Pacific spreads like hammered pewter. Yamada flies in the number 3 position, his wingtips almost kissing the aircraft beside him. The formation is tight, disciplined, beautiful, a demonstration of the Seishin, the fighting spirit that the Navy drills into every pilot from his first day of training. They climb to 18,000 feet. The air is thin and cold. Yamada's breath fogs inside his oxygen mask. Radio chatter is minimal, professional. They are hunting, and hunters do not need many words. Then the radar operator's voice crackles to the headset. Multiple contacts, bearing 045, range 40 kilometers, altitude 20,000 feet. Yamada's pulse quickens. This is it. This is what they came for. The formation banks northeast, climbing into the sun. Standard tactics. Get above the enemy. Use altitude advantage. Strike from the blind spot. It has worked 100 times before. It will work again. Yamada checks his guns, flips the arming switches. The Zero responds like an extension of his will, nimble and eager. For a moment, he allows himself to imagine the combat report he will file tonight. 3 kills, possibly 4. His squadron commander will nod approvingly. There will be sake. There will be songs. Then he sees them. At first, they are just dark specks against a cloud bank, growing larger with impossible speed. Yamada squints against the glare. The silhouettes are wrong. Too big, too angular. Not wildcats. Something else. His radio erupts with urgent voices. The Americans have turned into them, not away. They are climbing, not diving for cover. And they are closing the distance faster than anything Yamada has ever seen. The first American fighter, a Grumman F-6F Hellcat, flashes past Yamada's canopy, so close he can see the rivets in its wing panels. It is enormous, a full 2,000 pounds heavier than a Zero, powered by a Pratt & Whitney R 2800 engine that generates 2,000 horsepower, nearly twice the power of a Sake engine. The Hellcat's wings are thick, stubby, nothing like the elegant curves of Japanese design. It looks brutal, functional, graceless. And it is fast. Yamada pushes his throttle to the firewall, trying to follow, but the Hellcat semi-extends away from him, climbing at an angle that should be impossible for something so heavy. His Zero, which has dominated every dogfight for 3 years, suddenly feels like a rickshaw chasing a locomotive. The sky erupts. Tracers arc through the air in glowing nets. Yamada throws his stick hard left, feeling the Zero respond with its legendary agility. But when he looks for a firing solution, the Hellcat is already gone, repositioning above him. Another Zero explodes to his right, a sudden orange flower blooming at 19,000 feet. Yamada does not see what killed it. The Americans are everywhere and nowhere, appearing from angles that violate every rule of engagement he has been taught. A Hellcat dives past him, guns hammering, and Yamada catches a glimpse of the pilot through the canopy. No fear in that face, just cold calculation. The American pulls out of the dive with crushing G-forces that would black out most Japanese pilots. Their superior physical conditioning and G-suits allowing them to sustain maneuvers that turn the Zero's agility into a liability. Yamada tries to engage. He selects a target, lines up his gun sight, squeezes a trigger. His 20mm cannons bark, short bursts to conserve ammunition, just as he has been trained. The shells pass behind the Hellcat's tail. The American aircraft jinks slightly, almost contemptuously, and then it is gone, accelerating away with contemptuous ease. Yamada's Zero, with its magnificent range and delicate handling, cannot catch it, cannot even keep it in sight. He feels something he has not felt since his first solo flight as a cadet: helplessness. The engagement lasts 7 minutes. When it ends, 9 Zeros are gone. Yamada's radio is silent except for ragged breathing. He looks around the sky and counts only 14 aircraft from the original 23. The Americans have disappeared as suddenly as they arrived, not pursued, not triumphant, simply finished with a day's work. Yamada's hands are shaking on the control stick. His Senenbari belt feels suddenly heavy, weighted with the knowledge that all those prayers might not be enough. This is not how it's supposed to be. To understand the shock that Takeo Yamada experienced in the sky over the marshals, one must return to the beginning, to the moment when Japanese naval aviation became the most feared aerial force in the world. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor. The attack that changed everything. When Commander Mitsuo Fukuda led 353 aircraft over Oahu that Sunday morning, they did not merely strike a naval base. They shattered the illusion of Western invincibility in the Pacific. The Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers and Aichi D-3A dive bombers performed with surgical precision, but it was the Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighter that captured the imagination and terror of the world. The Zero was, in 1941, the finest carrier-based fighter aircraft on Earth. No hyperbole, no nationalist pride, simply fact. With a top speed of 331 miles per hour, a climb rate of 3,000 feet per minute, and a combat radius of over 1,000 miles, it could fly farther, climb faster, and turn tighter than any American fighter in service. Its armament, 2 20mm cannons and 2 7.7mm machine guns, was devastating. But more than specifications, the Zero possessed something intangible. Key, a kind of living spirit that bonded pilot and machine. It was so light, so responsive, that experienced pilots claimed they could will it to the sky with thought alone. In the 6 months following Pearl Harbor, the Zero carved a path of destruction across the Pacific that seemed unstoppable. Over the Philippines, over the Dutch East Indies, over Burma and New Guinea, Allied pilots learned to fear the sight of that distinctive elliptical wing and blood-red sun. Combat reports from American and British pilots read like horror stories. The Zero could turn inside any Allied fighter. It could outclimb them, outrun them in a stern chase, and maintain combat effectiveness at altitudes where American engines gasped for air. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, Zeros established air superiority against numerically superior forces. At Midway a month later, despite the catastrophic loss of 4 Japanese carriers, the Zeros still dominated every dogfight, claiming kills at rates that seemed impossible. Japanese pilots were not merely competent. They were superbly trained veterans of the brutal air campaigns over China, where they had honed their skills against outnumbered but courageous opponents. The Imperial Navy's flight training program was ruthlessly selective. Of every 100 candidates who began training, only 25 would earn their wings. The survivors logged over 700 flight hours before their first combat mission, 3 times the training American pilots received in early 1942. They practiced formation flying until they could maintain wingtip-to-wingtip positioning in clouds. They rehearsed gunnery until they could hit a target while pulling 6G turns. They studied Bushido, the samurai code, until they understood that death in combat was not failure but transcendence. And they believed, that is crucial, Japanese pilots in 1942 and early 1943 believed with religious certainty that they were invincible. This was not mere propaganda or nationalist fervor. It was empirical observation. They had seen American pilots panic, break formation, flee. They had watched wildcats fall like burning leaves. They had counted kills that seemed almost unfair, like adults fighting children. The psychological advantage was as significant as any technical specification. When you know you cannot be beaten, you fight with a freedom that skill alone cannot provide. But empires built on early victories carry within them the seeds of their own obsolescence. While Japanese pilots were racking up kills in 1942, American engineers were already at work in factories from Long Island to Southern California, designing the aircraft that would reclaim the sky. And unlike the Japanese war machine, which had stretched its industrial capacity to the breaking point, American production was just beginning to accelerate. The Americans had studied the Zero carefully. In June 1942, a relatively intact Zero crash-landed on Akutan Island in Alaska after its pilot was killed attempting an emergency landing. American forces recovered the aircraft, shipped it to Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego, and subjected it to exhaustive testing. They flew it against every American fighter in inventory. They measured its strengths and mapped its weaknesses. What they discovered was both impressive and illuminating. The Zero's magnificent performance came at a price. To achieve its range and agility, Mitsubishi had sacrificed almost everything else. The Zero had no armor protection for the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks. Its lightweight construction meant that even a few hits from .50 caliber machine guns could tear it apart. It was an aircraft designed for offense, assuming air superiority, assuming short, decisive engagements. It was not designed for the kind of war the Americans were about to bring. In the design halls of Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation on Long Island, engineers took the lessons from the captured Zero and applied them to their next-generation fighter. The result was the F-6F Hellcat, an aircraft that embodied a completely different philosophy of aerial combat. Where the Zero was light and elegant, the Hellcat was heavy and brutal. Where the Zero relied on maneuverability, the Hellcat relied on speed and firepower. It could not outturn a Zero. It didn't try to. Instead, it could outdive it, outclimb it, and most importantly, absorb punishment that would disintegrate a Zero and keep flying. The Hellcat's 2,000 horsepower engine gave it a top speed of 380 miles per hour. Nearly 50 miles per hour faster than the Zero. Its 6.50 caliber machine guns fired 2,400 rounds per minute collectively, a rate of fire that could saw a Zero in half. Armor plating protected the pilot's back and head. Self-sealing fuel tanks meant that even when hit, the Hellcat would not become a flying bomb. and it was being produced at a rate that would have seemed like science fiction to Japanese industry. Over 12,000 Hellcats would roll off American assembly lines during the war, while Japan struggled to replace its losses with a few hundred Zeros per year. But the Hellcat was only part of the transformation. The Americans were also revolutionizing the tactics, training, and doctrine of aerial warfare. They abandoned the individual dogfight mentality that had characterized early Pacific air combat and embraced formation tactics that leveraged their aircraft strengths. The Thatch Weave, developed by Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, allowed pairs of American fighters to cover each other's vulnerable tail positions, negating the Zeros' turning advantage. Boom and zoom tactics taught pilots to use their superior speed and diving performance to attack from above, fire, and disengage before the Zero could bring its agility to bear. Most importantly, American pilots were trained to be flexible, adaptable, to think of aerial combat not as individual duels, but as coordinated team efforts. And the Americans had something else, something that would prove more decisive than any specification or tactic. They had an industrial base that could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. American factories in 1943 were producing aircraft at rates that staggered comprehension. The Willow Run plan in Michigan rolled out AB, 24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. Grumman's Bethpage facility produced Hellcats around the clock, 3 shifts, 7 days a week. The Americans were not just building aircraft. They were building mountains of aircraft, tsunamis of aircraft, an endless metallic tide that would eventually drown Japanese resistance through sheer material superiority. But none of this was apparent to Lieutenant Yamada in January 1944. The intelligence briefings mentioned increased American production, but the numbers seemed abstract, impossible. Surely, his commanders reasoned. The reports were exaggerated. Surely, American pilots were still the undisciplined rabble they had been at Coral Sea. Surely, the Zero's qualitative superiority would compensate for any numerical disadvantages. This was not denial. It was a natural human tendency to believe that yesterday's victories predict tomorrow's outcomes. The encounter over the marshals shattered that illusion with the force of a brick through stained glass. When Yamada lands back in the Zuikaku, his Zero riddled with holes from a Hellcat's guns that should have killed him but somehow didn't. He does not speak for several minutes. He sits in the debriefing room with the other survivors and listens to their reports. The stories are all variations on the same theme. We couldn't catch them. We couldn't hurt them. They hit us at will. One pilot, a veteran of Pearl Harbor with 34 kills to his credit, breaks down crying. Not from fear, but from the sudden comprehension that everything is mastered over 4 years of combat has become obsolete in a single morning. The squadron commander tries to maintain morale. The Americans were lucky, he says. They had numerical superiority. Next time, we will adjust our tactics. But Yamada can see the truth in the commander's eyes. He knows. They all know. The sky has changed hands. Over the following months, the pattern repeats with devastating consistency. The Americans are not merely flying better aircraft. They are flying them in greater numbers with increasingly sophisticated tactics. In February 1944, during Operation Hailstone, American carrier aircraft strike the Japanese naval base at Truk Lagoon in the Caroline Islands. Over 2 days, they destroyed 270 Japanese aircraft, sink 12 freighters, and devastate facilities that had been considered impregnable. Japanese pilots scrambled to intercept, and they are slaughtered. The Hellcats hunt in packs, coordinate their attacks with radar guidance from their carriers, and press their advantages with a cold efficiency that leaves no room for the individual heroics that characterized Japanese doctrine. In June 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, an engagement that American pilots will grimly nickname the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the transformation reaches its terrible climax. The Japanese launch massive raids from their carriers, hoping to overwhelm the American fleet through sheer numbers. What follows is a massacre of almost unimaginable proportions. American Hellcats, guided by radar, intercept the Japanese formations before they even reach the fleet. They tear through the attacking aircraft like chainsaws through paper. Of the 373 Japanese carrier aircraft launched that day, 243 are shot down. American losses, 29 aircraft. The kill ratio is better than 8-1. Lieutenant Yamada participates in the second wave of attacks during the Philippine Sea Battle. He watches a Hellcat fire a burst into a Zero ahead of him, watches the unarmored aircraft disintegrate in midair, watches the pilot tumble through space with his parachute already on fire. Yamada jinks left, drops altitude, tries to use clouds for cover. A Hellcat drops onto his tail, so quickly he doesn't see where it came from. Cannon shells walk up his left wing, shredding aluminum. He throws his Zero into the tightest turn he can manage, a maneuver that would have shaken any American fighter 6 months ago, but the Hellcat simply pulls up, loops over, and is waiting for him when he completes the turn. It is not possible. Physics does not work this way. But the Hellcat's superior power and the American pilot's G-suit allow maneuvers that the Zero's agility cannot counter. Yamada survives only because another Zero accidentally flies between him and the Hellcat, absorbing the burst meant for Yamada. He does not see where the other pilot crashes. He runs for home, his Zero barely flying, hydraulic fluid streaming from severed lines. When he lands, he counts 18 holes in his aircraft. The maintenance chief tells him the Zero is unsalvageable. There are not enough spare parts to repair it. There are not enough new aircraft to replace it. Yamada will fly a patched-together Zero next mission, one assembled from pieces of 3 different wrecks. That night, he takes out his Senembari belt and counts the stitches. 1,000 prayers. He wonders how many of the women who sewed those stitches understood that prayers alone cannot stop .50 caliber bullets. He wonders if any of them knew that their sons and husbands were being sent to die in aircraft that were obsolete before they took off. The psychological impact of this reversal on Japanese pilots was profound and, in many ways, more destructive than the material losses. These men had built their identities around aerial superiority. They were not merely pilots. They were Senekitai, warriors of the sky, heirs to a samurai tradition adapted for the age of machines. Their training had indoctrinated them to believe that spirit could overcome material disadvantages, that ki was stronger than steel. And for 2 years, that belief had been validated by victory after victory. Now, it was revealed as a beautiful lie. Captured documents and post-war interrogations reveal the depth of this disillusionment. Japanese pilots began to speak of American aircraft in terms that bordered on superstition. The Hellcat was not merely a superior machine. It was an Oni, a demon, an unnatural thing that violated the proper order of the universe. How could something so heavy, so graceless, dominate something as pure and refined as a Zero? It was not merely a military defeat. It was an ontological crisis. The principles they had been taught, the values they had internalized, were failing them, and there was no explanation that did not call into question everything they believed about themselves and their nation. The American abundance became a recurring symbol in Japanese pilot counts. It was not just the quality of American aircraft, but their quantity that broke morale. Japanese pilots would shoot down 2, 3 for American planes, only to see 6 more take their place. They would return to their carriers to find that fuel was rationed, that ammunition was limited, that spare parts were unavailable, and then they would hear intelligence reports of American carriers launching hundreds of aircraft simultaneously, each one fully fueled, fully armed, flown by a pilot who would be replaced within days if he was shot down. One Japanese pilot, in a letter home that was intercepted by sensors, wrote, "We face an enemy who treats aircraft the way we treat bullets. They do not count them. They do not conserve them. They simply make more. How do you defeat an enemy who can afford to lose? It was a question that had no answer within the framework of Japanese military philosophy. The Imperial Navy had designed its entire war strategy around a decisive battle. Kantai-Kessen, the climactic engagement where the superior skill and spirit of Japanese forces would destroy the American fleet in a single glorious confrontation. They had not planned for a war of attrition, a grinding industrial conflict where production capacity mattered more than individual heroism. The Zero, magnificent as it was, had been designed for the war Japan wanted to fight, not the war America brought to them. By late 1944, the disparity had become almost comical in its absurdity. American pilots were being sent into combat with less than 300 hours of flight training, a fraction of what Japanese pilots received in 1941. And yet they were winning. The reason was simple. The Hellcat was so superior, so forgiving of pilot error, so durable under fire, that even mediocre pilots could achieve kills against veteran Japanese aviators in Zeros. The aircraft itself compensated for the pilot's inexperience. It was a systemic advantage that no amount of individual skill could overcome, and the Americans kept improving. In late 1944, the Grumman F-8F Bearcat entered production, an aircraft even faster and more powerful than a Hellcat. The chance-bought F-4U Corsair, with its distinctive inverted gull wings and 2,000 horsepower engine, was dominating Pacific skies with kill ratios that approached 11-1. American pilots were being trained not just in flying, but in radio discipline, radar interpretation, oxygen system management, and coordinated attack patterns. The entire structure of American naval aviation had become a machine for converting industrial output into air superiority. The symbolic turning point, if such things could be dated precisely, came in October 1944 during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The Japanese, desperate to prevent the American reconquest of the Philippines, launched Operation Shogo 1, throwing the remnants of their carrier fleet into a last-ditch effort to destroy the invasion force. The Americans, by contrast, deployed 17 aircraft carriers, 11 fleet carriers, and 6 light carriers, carrying over 1,000 aircraft. The numerical disparity was so vast that it ceased to be a battle and became an execution. Lieutenant Yamada flew in one of the final strikes of that battle. His Zero, now so heavily patched that its serial number was barely visible beneath layers of welded plate, struggled to maintain formation. Of the 60 aircraft that launched with him, only 19 returned. Yamada himself got close enough to an American destroyer to see sailors on the deck manning anti-aircraft guns. The volume of flak was so dense that flying through it felt like swimming through a sandstorm. He never reached weapons release range. He simply turned back, his ammunition expended against Hellcats that refused to die, and flew home to a carrier that was already receiving orders to withdraw. The Zuikaku itself would be sunk weeks later during the battle off Cape Engano, the last of the Japanese carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor. When it slipped beneath the waves, it took with it not just aircraft and men, but an entire philosophy of warfare that had proven inadequate to the industrial age. There is a tendency in historical writing to treat this transformation as inevitable, to see American victory as foreordained by superior resources. But that reading strips the story of its human dimension. For pilots like Yamada, there was nothing inevitable about it. They had dominated the sky for 2 years. They had been told their spirit was invincible. They had seen the evidence of their superiority in burning American wrecks scattered across the Pacific. The reversal, when it came, was not gradual but catastrophic. A sudden comprehension that the war they thought they were fighting had ended, and a new war, one they could not win, had begun. In the final months of the war, Japanese pilots flew increasingly desperate missions. The advent of kamikaze tactics in late 1944 was not merely a reflection of Japan's deteriorating strategic position, but an acknowledgement that conventional aerial combat had become suicidal. If a pilot was going to die anyway, And by early 1945, that was almost certain, then at least a deliberate crash into an enemy ship accomplished something. The kamikaze was not a tactic born of strength, but a recognition that strength had failed. Yamada did not become a kamikaze. He was shot down in March 1945 during a raid against American carriers off Okinawa. His Zero was hit by anti-aircraft fire, then finished off by a Hellcat that appeared from nowhere. They always appear from nowhere now, and stitched his cockpit with .50 caliber rounds. He managed to bail out before the Zero exploded. He was picked up by an American destroyer 3 hours later, pulled from the water by sailors who gave him coffee and a blanket, and treated his wounds with a casual efficiency that was, in its own way, more demoralizing than cruelty would have been. In the POW camp, he met other Japanese pilots. They compared notes, shared stories, tried to make sense of what had happened. The Americans, they concluded, had not been better pilots. That was important to maintain. Individual skill still mattered, but the Americans had been flying a different war, a war where production and logistics and systemic advantages overwhelmed personal valor. One pilot, drunk on illicitly brewed sake, put it bluntly, "They didn't outfly us, they outbuilt us." And there is no honor code for that. The sky over the Pacific had changed hands not through a single decisive battle, but through 10,000 small encounters where American aircraft arrived with more fuel, more ammunition, more backup, and more confidence that if they died, another pilot would take their place tomorrow. The Japanese had fought with the desperation of men who knew each loss was irreplaceable. The Americans had fought with the calm assurance of men who knew the factory was already building their replacement. After the war, Yamada returned to Japan to find his country in ruins. The cities he had sworn to protect were ash. The empire he had fought for had dissolved. He found work as a mechanic, repairing American cars for occupation forces, an irony so bitter he could taste it every morning. On his workbench, he kept a small model of a Zero that he had carved from scrap wood. He never flew again. Years later, in the 1960s, an American historian interviewing Japanese veterans asked Yamada when he knew the war was lost. Yamada thought for a long time before answering. January 17, 1944, he finally said, over the marshals, "When I saw that the Americans had built something we couldn't match, not because we lacked skill, not because we lacked courage, but because they could build 10 for every one we made, and their 10 were better than our one, that's when I knew." The historian asked what he felt in that moment. Yamada looked out the window at the Tokyo skyline, rebuilt with American money, bristling with American-style skyscrapers. "Relief," he said quietly, "because it meant I was allowed to stop believing the lie that spirit alone could defeat steel." The sky over the Pacific had changed hands. The pilots who once owned it learned, in the most visceral way possible, that technological and industrial superiority renders individual heroism insufficient. The Americans had not merely built better aircraft. They had built a system that could generate air superiority as reliably as a factory produced rivets. And against that system, courage and training and tradition were revealed as necessary but not sufficient. The Zero, that beautiful aircraft that had terrorized the Pacific, became a museum piece, a reminder that wars are won not by the best weapon but by the best industrial base supporting adequate weapons. The Hellcat, graceless and brutal, became the instrument of victory precisely because it embodied a different philosophy. Not elegance but effectiveness, not spirit but system. In the end, the sky belonged to those who could fill it. That was a lesson written in the contrails over the Pacific, signed in the blood of pilots from both sides. The Japanese had flown into battle, expecting the war they had prepared for. The Americans had brought them the war of the future, and the future, it turned out, was built in the factories of Detroit and Long Island in Southern California, one Hellcat at a time, relentless as a tide.